Let's start with a short review of some of the main points we covered yesterday before we move on in our discussions. So, of course, this weekend is Discovering Buddhism Module 9, titled Samsara and Nirvana. And we saw there that this topic of Samsara and Nirvana relates to what's called the person of middling capacity. So, within the Lam Rim, which is the structure of the path that's set out within the Geluk school of Tibetan Buddhism, we talk about taking advantage of this precious human life at three levels of capacity. And so we saw there at the initial level of capacity, we would simply strive for a good future by being ethical. So that's someone of initial capacity. But even if we strive for a good future in this life and in future lives, we're still stuck in this cycle of existence called samsara. So then we can go to the next level of making this life meaningful by striving to break free of this cycle altogether. And so that person of middling capacity then has the goal of nirvana, of breaking free of samsara. And this is what we are, of course, covering this weekend. How are we stuck in this cycle and how do we break free of the cycle? But then, of course, even at that level of making our life meaningful, striving for nirvana, someone of middling capacity, we can understand that everyone else is in the same situation as ourselves. So then we can go to the next level, and that is someone of great capacity, where they strive not only for their own personal liberation from samsara, but they strive for the goal of enlightenment so that then we can be most effective in helping to liberate others from suffering. So this is someone of great capacity. And this, of course, is nowadays the Buddhist traditions who have this as the goal are called the Mahayana Buddhist traditions. So there, of course, to enter into that level of practice, we have to develop that aspiration for enlightenment, which of course is bodhicitta. We become then a bodhisattva and we strive for the goal of enlightenment. So this is the topic for the next 2 or 3 modules that you'll have in this program, how to develop this bodhicitta, and then in particular how to cultivate this wisdom of emptiness that we briefly touched on yesterday if we want to achieve the goal of enlightenment. And of course, also at that level, someone of great capacity, we can also then enter into a level of practice called Tantra or Vajrayana, where we still have the same goal of enlightenment, we're developing the same aspiration of bodhicitta, but in Tantra or Vajrayana, we're trying to gain access to a deeper level of our mind, this very subtle mind, sometimes called the mind of clear light. And if we can gain access to that level of our mind in meditation, we can accelerate the spiritual path to enlightenment. So we're still developing the same wisdom of emptiness, but now in Tantra, we are using the very subtle mind to realize emptiness, not the coarse mind that we're using in the lower levels of practice. So this is basically where this fits into that scheme of laying out the path to enlightenment. So within the level we're looking at, then of course this is based on the very first teaching that the Buddha gave, the Four Noble Truths teachings after he achieved enlightenment. And we saw there that we used this analogy of a physical illness to describe these Four Noble Truths, that the Buddha was being like our doctor. So initially he was of course diagnosing what condition do we find ourselves in. And so, of course, the condition we find ourselves in, he described that using the word dukkha. So that's the first noble truth, that we find ourselves in this state of dukkha. And again, this is a classic example of where the original Sanskrit word, very difficult to translate into English. In fact, often we find these very precise terms in Sanskrit. There is no word in English that has the same precise meaning. And so then the translator's forced to pick a word that sort of as closely as possible matches that meaning, but often there is no word, so then a lot of confusion can arise due to that, simply the terminology. So I think it's always good, and fortunately we see this more and more happening, more and more the original Sanskrit terms are being used for these important terms. Things like dukkha, samsara, nirvana, bodhisattva, bodhicitta, Buddha, karma. All of these terms are now being more and more used, which I think is a good thing, because then you know precisely what that term means. So here, remember, to understand this word dukkha, we talked about the 3 levels of dukkha. The first one was the dukkha of suffering, meaning that, yes, part of the human condition is we have unpleasant, painful, suffering experiences. That one's pretty obvious. Then we talked about the dukkha of change, which was relating to our pleasant experiences. So also, of course, in the human condition, sometimes we have pleasant experiences, but now, often, unfortunately, we identify those pleasant experiences as happiness, and thereby we develop craving and attachment for them because we're hoping that they're going to fulfill us and satisfy us. Of course, they're never going to do that, and to help us to let go of that craving and attachment to those pleasant experiences, the Buddha used the word change to describe these pleasant experiences, to highlight to us that they are simply temporary, transient experiences that are never going to fulfill us. And if we can let go of that craving and attachment, we can simply enjoy those pleasant experiences without inducing a lot of unnecessary suffering because of that craving and attachment. But of course, what we saw was that underlying both our pleasant and unpleasant experiences, there's something deeper going on in the human condition. And that was this all-pervasive dukkha. And that was basically describing the fact that we always have a potential for suffering. Our life is pervaded by that potential in every single moment. And why is that potential there? Why is there a potential for us to suffer in every single moment? Is because our mind is contaminated by the mental afflictions. So as long as we have things like anger, craving, jealousy, frustration, anxiety, depression, and so forth, as long as these mental afflictions are in our mind, there's always a potential for suffering to arise. So that's the deepest understanding of the word dukkha. So if we really want to realize what is the human condition at the deepest level, that's the one we're most interested in. The suffering is very obvious. Change, if we think about it a bit, we can come to appreciate that there's no point in craving, grasping pleasant experiences. It's not going to help. But then we really need to reflect at that deepest level. But to be able to do that, of course, we need to really appreciate the second noble truth, the cause or origin of dukkha or suffering. We need to reflect about these mental afflictions. In particular, in that second noble truth, to really reflect on the fact that these mental afflictions are coming from our fundamental ignorance. The fundamental ignorance, misunderstanding nature of reality. And if we can understand that, in particular, we can then understand that we can correct this mistaken view of reality by realizing the nature of reality. Then we can understand that, in fact, we can eliminate this ignorance and thereby eliminate those mental afflictions and thereby eliminate all our suffering. So if we can really appreciate this, then we can develop this aspiration for liberation to break free of samsara. And this aspiration, of course, in Sanskrit was this ni-sarana. Ni, remember, meant out or away. Sarana means to move or to go. So ni-sarana was this aspiration to move out of, to move away from samsara, of course, to the goal of nirvana. And here's another example of how terminology creates a lot of confusion, because unfortunately, some years ago, someone decided that a good translation for ni-sarana, and the equivalent word in Tibetan is ner-chung, which has the same meaning. Someone translated that as renunciation, and it sort of stuck, and now it's widely used. And that really just creates a lot of confusion, because this we're talking about is the entry point into the Buddhist spiritual path. If we want to achieve liberation, we have to develop this aspiration that is often called renunciation. And then, of course, people hear that and they go, I don't want to become a Buddhist because I don't want to renounce and give up all my pleasurable experiences in life, because that's often what people think renunciation means. But of course, that's not what it means. Of course, we have to give up something, but what we need to give up is not pleasurable experiences. Whether or not we have pleasurable experiences is not the issue. The issue is how we relate to those pleasant experiences. And if we think or hope that they're going to fulfill us and give us some genuine lasting happiness, we're in trouble. So renunciation is about giving up an unhealthy attitude. In other words, give up craving and attachment to pleasant experiences, because that's just going to create suffering. But it really, the original word and a better word, the original word nisarana, would be something like just simply the aspiration for liberation, the aspiration to break free.
Nibbur is translated quite nicely.
Oh, good, very good. So then, in terms of the mental afflictions, when we see an extensive presentation of the mental afflictions, you'll see a list of 26 mental afflictions. They're called the 6 root mental afflictions and the 20 secondary mental afflictions. And so we listed briefly those 6 root mental afflictions, which again, of course, was ignorance, attachment, aversion, pride, doubt, and these afflicted views. But if we really want to focus on the main ones, we can condense that list of 6 to 3, the 3 poisons, which are going to come up again in this diagram later today. And the 3 poisons, the 3 core mental afflictions, of course, is ignorance, attachment, and aversion. Sometimes the aversion is listed as anger, anger just being, of course, a strong type of aversion. But the 3 are ignorance, attachment, and aversion. And so we had a look at, particularly yesterday, the attachment and aversion, or certainly aversion in terms of anger. And remember that ignorance is our fundamental ignorance, the distorted view of reality. So here in this foundation level, the Four Noble Truths level of teachings, when we talk about the fundamental ignorance, there in those teachings it's said that the fundamental ignorance, the root of all of our mental afflictions and suffering, is a distorted view of me, person. That we overinflate the sense of me and we're grasping onto what's called a self. That instinctively we feel as if here somewhere is something more than just the body and the mind. There's something extra. There's a me on top of the body and the mind, something more than the body and the mind. And we have that in our language. You know, we say, I have a body, I have a mind, as if there's a third thing, something distinct, a me that has a body and has a mind. And that's how we see ourselves, in this way. But this, according to the Four Noble Truths teachings here, is a false sense of me. There is nothing on top of extra than the body and the mind. There's not a self there that's like a master or controller of this body and mind. And if we can come to realize that, we can eliminate all mental afflictions, suffering, and achieve nirvana. Of course, here we're not saying there's no me, no person. There is no Buddhist tradition that says there's no me, no person. Because if there's no me, no person, you couldn't even entertain that idea. So the fact that you can think about that means you exist. The question is how we exist, not whether or not we exist. And here they say, in these teachings, we do not exist in this overinflated way as this, what's called self. And if we can realize that there's no such self, we can achieve liberation. And so then we looked in terms of these 2 core mental afflictions of attachment and aversion, or particularly we looked at anger. So remember, attachment was this mental factor that sees its object as attractive, it exaggerates the object's attractiveness, and then wishes to possess and hold the object. And we saw there how attachment really is causing us so much suffering. Because often people feel mistakenly that craving and attachment is actually necessary to be happy. And often people hear, when they hear, according to Buddhism, we need to get rid of attachment altogether, people often have a few concerns or misunderstandings. They think, well, If I do that, my life's going to be very bland and boring. I'm not going to be able to enjoy anything in life. Actually, as we saw yesterday, it's the complete opposite. A craving and attachment interferes with our enjoyment of the simple pleasures in life, because with craving and attachment comes with that worry and anxiety about not getting it, frustration when we don't get it, overindulging when we get and suffering, and then end up more craving. And also that craving and attachment, because it's always looking for something bigger, better and different, it means actually we stop enjoying the things we used to, because now craving and attachment says that's not good enough anymore. I need something bigger, better and different. So actually craving and attachment really interferes with and destroys our enjoyment of the simple pleasures in life. And if we reduce and eliminate it, we'll enjoy simple pleasures in life much more than we've ever done before. And also in relationships, but because often people say, but I need an attachment to have a relationship. But again, it's the complete opposite. Attachment interferes with relationships, causes problems in relationships. And what we need to realize here is that there are two dynamics in a relationship. There's the healthy dynamic of love or loving kindness, which is simply wishing the other person to be happy. And then there's the very unhealthy dynamic of craving and attachment, which is all about me, and sees the other person as an object to satisfy me. So that's very unhealthy. So we need to distinguish those two dynamics and try and reduce the attachment and increase the loving kindness as much as possible, and then our relationships will become more healthy and improve. And also in the area of creativity, we saw that craving and attachment interferes with creativity. That as long as our mind is agitated by mental afflictions such as craving, jealousy, anxiety, anger, we're suffering our creativity. If we reduce and eliminate them, you'll find you'll become much more creative for a much more worthwhile, beneficial reason. And similarly with anger, we saw that anger is very destructive, and most of us realize anger is very destructive, but still there's some doubts. And often people say things like, but I need anger to deal with difficult situations. And we saw there, yes, of course, anger is very forceful, but it's out of control because anger exaggerates and distorts. And we know from our own experience, if we have very strong anger, we often overreact, and rather than resolving an issue, difficult issue, we compound it, we make it worse. So the Buddhist assertion, of course, here is we don't need anger to deal with difficult situations. Rather, we use patience. And again, patience is simply remaining calm in the face of a difficult situation so we can better evaluate it, and then we can respond with compassion. And compassion can be very forceful because compassion is about helping that person to overcome suffering. So if they're behaving in a very bad way, being physically violent, with a very strong compassion, we can physically restrain that person if need be. And we saw there that yesterday that one of the reasons that we tend to instinctively we get angry with people who behave badly rather than have compassion for them is this idea of cognitive fusion. That we have a false perspective where we identify ourselves and others with our behavior. And if we do that, then it's going to be impossible to develop compassion for people who behave badly, and it's going to be very difficult to have compassion for ourselves if we behave badly, because we're going to see others and ourselves simply as bad people, and bad people don't deserve compassion. But again, there's no such thing as a bad person. That is an invalid perspective. There are two things here. There's a person and their behavior. They're not one thing. But if we do that cognitive fusion, then, because the thing we don't like is their behavior. But if we stick that to the person, then we direct at the person. We attack the person, which is useless because it just gets worse. So therefore, if we avoid cognitive fusion, have the correct perspective and simply acknowledge there's a person engaging in harmful behavior, we can accept the person, have compassion and forgiveness of the person, at the same time not tolerate that negative behavior and be very forceful about that negative behavior and help them to overcome that negative behavior. And the same applies to ourselves. And that's why we have so much low self-esteem, guilt and self-hatred in our modern society. We do this cognitive fusion. And in our modern society, we're always focusing on the negative. Negative, negative, negative. So no wonder there is this epidemic of low self-esteem and self-hatred in our modern society. So simply, if we just avoid cognitive fusion with ourselves, we can simply acknowledge, yes, I've done this harmful thing, kind and compassionate to ourselves, and not tolerate our negative behavior and overcome that negative behavior. And so then yesterday also, we looked at how then this ignorance and mental afflictions lead to us being in this state of dukkha. And so we had this chart here, this suffering and its causes chart, which I'd like to return to this morning. Because what we said here was, yesterday, was that to overcome the state of dukkha, to liberate ourselves from the cycle of existence called samsara, we need to go back to the underlying cause, which was ignorance, this mistaken view of reality. So to overcome this, we need the vipassana practice, the wisdom practice. So this is the long-term strategy that to overcome suffering, to overcome samsara and achieve nirvana, we need to overcome ignorance, develop this wisdom. But of course, we also would like, but that may take quite some time. So it would be good to have, together with a long-term strategy, a short-term strategy. What can we do right now in a practical way to at least reduce the negative impact of this process while we're working on the long-term strategy? So that's what I'd like to look at now. What can we do at each one of these stages right now to at least reduce the impact of that process? But before I do that, maybe it's good to just go through these steps again so we have them clear in our mind. And particularly Nissim needs to pay attention because this is what he's going to be presenting this afternoon, the question. He's going to go through these 6 steps again and explain again this afternoon. In fact, what we'll do this afternoon is maybe he can present that in Hebrew so you can get the Hebrew version of this. Good?
So you will never know if you make some
No,
mistake.
Shuki can be my adjudicator.
I see.
He can give the thumbs up or the thumbs down to the presentation. Right. So remember, seed of ignorance. And here in this chart, I was using the ignorance that we don't really see so much in the Four Noble Truths, but in the Mahayana. This more deeper level of ignorance of grasping onto independent me, independent world. You know, grasping on that everything exists independently. And seed, of course, is the habit of that. So we've had the habit of doing that since we were born and well before that, according to Buddhism. And then, of course, when we look out on the world, everything appears to us to exist completely independent of us. And this is called this mistaken dualistic appearance. That there appears to be subject-object duality. There appears to be a me here and a world there, completely independent of me. But this view of emptiness is saying these appearances are deceiving us. So that's why it's called mistaken dualistic appearance, because that's not how things really exist. But of course, everything exists to us in this way. Everything appears to us in this way, and this is the only way things have appeared to us. So there's no reason for us to question appearances because we've never experienced anything else. And if we ask anyone else, they'll say the same thing. So there's no reason to question appearances. So we never do. We just simply accept appearances and we end up at step 2. And this is not intellectual. This is instinctive. Instinctively, we are grasping onto me here, world there. And then we saw with every experience, we have this mental factor of feeling, which is experiencing things as either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And remember, so we will use, now that Nissim's bought some flowers, that's usually my example, we'll use the flowers as the example. Ah, see? See, he's even brought the flowers for his presentation this afternoon. Very good. But yours as well. So let's say we're looking at these flowers and we're having a pleasant experience. And that pleasant experience, together with our belief that those flowers exist completely independent of us, will naturally lead me to assume, of course, there must be some attractive quality there that's causing my pleasant feeling. So we're going to see these flowers as inherently attractive or attractive from their own side. Or similarly, if we're having an unpleasant experience, we'll naturally assume they must be inherently unattractive. There must be some unattractive quality there that's causing my unpleasant experience. So this is, of course, a misconception according to this view of emptiness. But once we get there, then step 4 easily follows. Because again, if we're having a pleasant experience when we see those flowers, I like pleasant experiences, I want pleasant experiences, those flowers seem to be causing my pleasant experience, I want those flowers, which is, of course, attachment. Or if I'm having an unpleasant experience, I don't like them, I don't want them, those flowers seem to be causing my unpleasant experience, get them out of here, aversion. Or if it's a neutral experience, we're just reinforcing our mistaken belief that those flowers exist independent of me, which here is listed as confusion, but this is just another word for ignorance. So these are the 3 core mental afflictions, the 3 poisons, and from those all the other mental afflictions arise from one of them or a combination. All the other mental afflictions come from those 3. And then that's what's driving our behavior. And every action we do based on a mental affliction has a result. And so the Buddhist assertion, of course, is that those actions lead to our experiences, and our experiences collectively are called dukkha. And so this is why we're stuck in the state of dukkha, because of this fundamental ignorance. And then we added one more thing to this yesterday, and that is, the question was, if things appear to exist independent of us, but they don't exist like that, why do we have that appearance in the first place, if they don't exist like that? And the reason is because when we have ignorance, a side effect of ignorance is that stains our mind, that ignorance. And that's called latency ignorance or stain of ignorance. And that stain in our mind, what that does, it sort of acts as like a filter. It means that when we come into contact with an object, we are observing the object through the stain of ignorance. That's why the object appears to exist in a mistaken dualistic way. It appears to exist independent of us, which means if we want to overcome this, we need to get rid of these stains. So what we saw yesterday was that in terms of samsara and nirvana, to overcome samsara, the cycle of existence in a state of dukkha, we need to get rid of the underlying cause, which is ignorance and the seed of ignorance. So this is what's called the afflictive obscurations. This is what's obscuring us from achieving nirvana. And when we get rid of ignorance through realizing nature of reality, and in this case, using this example, it would be the wisdom of emptiness, then we can transcend samsara, achieve nirvana, become an arhat. But even an arhat still have these stains because they're very difficult to get rid of. So even for an arhat, when they look out on the world appears to be independent of them. But they never accept those appearances because they, through realizing emptiness, they know that these appearances are deceptive. Like the analogy of a dream. In a dream, there appears to be independent me, independent dream world. And we buy into those appearances. Which means in a dream, if something pleasant happens, we have attachment, unpleasant, aversion, fear, anxiety, and so forth. But if we become lucid in the dream, then there still will appear to be an independent dream me, there'll still appear to be an independent dream world, but because we're lucid now, we know that these appearances are deceptive. We never buy into them, which means it becomes almost impossible to have attachment to pleasant things, aversion to unpleasant things in a lucid dream. We'll enjoy the dream a lot more. That's the similarity to an arhat, that they would never buy into those appearances because they know it's false, so that it never causes a problem. But they still need to get rid of those appearances. And so these stains and this mistaken dualistic appearance are what's called the cognitive obscurations. So that's what's stopping us from moving from nirvana to enlightenment. So we get rid of those stains by continuing to meditate on emptiness, but we need something a bit stronger, and that what is stronger together with emptiness is the bodhicitta. So that combination of emptiness and bodhicitta then is strong enough to slowly eliminate those stains. Now, at our level, even at the level of an arhat, you have to alternate, meaning either you're seeing the phenomenal world or you're in deep meditation on emptiness. And when you're realizing emptiness, nothing else is appearing. So you have to alternate those two. But when we get rid of these, when we sit down for the last time, just before we achieve enlightenment, and we realize emptiness and we eliminate that last subtle stain, then we achieve enlightenment, and simultaneously the phenomenal world appears to us, and we're still realizing emptiness. So an enlightened person can see the phenomenal world and realize emptiness simultaneously. What that really means for us is unimaginable, because we've never had that experience. Whereas before becoming enlightened, you either see the phenomenal world and it appears to exist independent, or you're realizing emptiness. You have to alternate. But when you become enlightened, they become simultaneous. So this is the long-term strategy. So let's now have a look at short-term strategy.
Glen, one question.
Sure.
Is the garlic and the smell of the garlic?
Yes, so one analogy that's often talked about in terms of what do we mean by stain is often the analogy in the teachings you see is that, you know, you have a bowl, the garlic is like the seed, you stick it in, even if you take it out, the garlic has stained the bowl with a smell. So that's often the analogy used to describe these latencies of ignorance.
Maybe it's too late or too early for this question. I listen to you and you explain to us, you are negating all our attitude. You explain to us that we are ignorant, the tree doesn't exist as we think, the beauty is not in the flower. You have explained to us until now all our mistakes according to Buddhist tradition. Am I right?
Mistakes in terms of how things exist,
Yes.
not what exists.
Yes, so this is my question. You say what is known. You explain to me how am I wrong. You explain to me how I'm asking you, can you please, or maybe it's too early, too late, I don't know, to say what is. I mean, what does affirmatively Buddhism say about everything that you said does not?
Yeah, well, I think you'll find you'll get a presentation of that in your module 12, the wisdom of emptiness. But a brief answer, and I touched on it briefly yesterday, is that often this emptiness, because it's a negation and it's very subtle, often people misinterpret that and they think it means nothing exists at all. So we're sort of, we have what's called the two extremes, existence and non-existence. We're camped in the extreme of existence now, grasping onto things existing independently. Emptiness undermines that. But for us now, there only seems to be two possibilities. Either there is this real independent functioning world or there's no world, because we can't entertain any other possibility. So once we start to undermine this supposed independent world through understanding emptiness, usually what happens is people flip to the other extreme. Oh, nothing exists.
No, but I'm just
Coming. Yeah, I'm coming. I'm building up to it. So often people misinterpret emptiness because it's very subtle, and they flip to the other extreme of non-existence. So to help us avoid that extreme, we can talk about the flip side of emptiness, which is dependent arising. The fact that things exist dependently. And we briefly mentioned that yesterday with big and small. Yeah? So we're negating big. We're affirming big, dependent big, aren't we? There is big relative to small. That's an affirmation.
Yes.
We're negating independent big. That's emptiness. Yes. But we're affirming there is big, but it only exists relative to small. So that's the other side of the coin.
Any other question?
Maybe I would like to understand it by an example that I felt. Sometimes it happens to me that when I dream and I believe the dramatic dream that I dream, and suddenly it happens to me a few times, not many times. In the dream, not being awake, I was aware that I'm dreaming.
Right, that's right.
Is this what you mean
Yeah.
by
So this is lucid dreaming. Yeah. This is lucid dreaming. Is within the dream you realize you're dreaming, and there are a number of ways we can develop lucid dreaming. One way we can do certain things to prepare ourselves. Lucid. Yeah. Yeah. One way we can develop lucid dreaming is before the dream, we can prepare ourselves for that. But another way is, as you said, is often something happens in the dream, we go, hang on, this is a bit strange, and that can cause us to become lucid. Similarly, normally the way to come to emptiness is you prepare by reflecting and meditating and moving towards that. But sometimes some have some experience that suddenly triggers something that, oh, hang on. And so people have these experiences. Like often it can be through nature, that often when you're in some nature experience and it's sort of overwhelming, this grasping to me just drops away, and then you have this sort of oneness experience with nature. Of course, hallucinogenic drugs can induce that as well. And there are a number of things like this where people can have a spontaneous experience in daily life. But often what can happen is that because there's an experience, but then people don't know what that means often. They think, oh, that was nice, you know. Oh, I had a nice experience in walking in the forest today. And then they go, oh, that's nice, and then that's it, finished. They don't really understand the implications of that experience. Whereas, of course, if we've studied and reflected and meditated and have that experience, we know, yes, and that can inspire us to continue on. But there are different ways you can come to that experience.
Can you say that, continuing Mayor questions, that the phenomena world, the objects, they exist, but they simply have attached to them the emptiness nature?
No. Again, it's not like.
Is it like in physics when you have particles and waves? You know, it's just a different way of looking at it. You know?
No, not quite. I mean, this is more classical physics. This view of emptiness is more quantum physics, where you talk about that. I don't know much about quantum physics, but you talk about everything being in a superposition state, meaning it's not existing. There's potential, and then there's different interpretations of quantum physics, of course, and one interpretation of quantum physics is that the wave function collapse, then things exist. Other interpretations are not agreeing with that, of course. There are a number of interpretations. But this view of emptiness is a little bit like that interpretation of quantum physics, whereby it's the act of observation which creates phenomena. There's not something there before that we're somehow measuring now. That's more classical physics. But of course, you know. Yeah.
Okay.
You know the expression "ignorance is bliss,"
In the Matrix.
Yeah.
In the Matrix.
and I'm thinking in terms of many people. You know, I think it's the United Nations. They do a survey around the world of happiness.
Yeah.
Of population,
Sure.
and they find certain places in the world where people say that they're happy when asked.
Yeah.
And you know, places like Melbourne in Australia, and it seems to me there's an element here of expectations, adjustment of expectations of what happiness means, and there's plenty of people who this whole paradigm doesn't really speak to them because they're not looking for fulfillment at any deep level. And if you say to them, are you happy? They're very happy. And why they're very happy, they'll say, during the week I suffer, I have difficulties, I work and we have to pay the bills and that, but that's okay because once a week we go to the pub and at the weekend I go watch the football.
Exactly.
And I have these pleasant experiences and it's not out of a craving. They know it's not out of control, that they have to have and their attachment and stuff. They're happy in small measures to base those pleasant experiences as giving them happiness. And then they'll say, my life, I'm happy with my life. And you know the examples of somebody who go and they'll win the lottery, but they won't give up their job working in the post office because they're quite happy with their lives. So how do you say to these people, no, you're not really, you're ignorant, and you don't know what fulfillment is, and you have to, seek more profound.
Well, we need to, it's just as Buddha did. He taught according to people's capacity. So, even people who have this sort of lifestyle, you can introduce ideas that would improve the quality of that. And then they go, oh, actually, I can improve on that a little bit. So if they're at this sort of bandwidth and you're introducing something up here, of course they're going to go away, what are you talking about? But that's why we need to that's why we have these stages for that purpose, exactly this purpose, this reason. So we need to do that. And I think that you will always be able to, no matter where people are, you'll be able to introduce ideas that they can relate to that can improve the quality of their life at whatever level they are.
It just seems to me that sometimes this is speaking to somebody who isn't happy. And and they're looking for the reason of their unhappiness and why.
And that's why I
feel fulfilled in my life and why.
And that's why.
Somebody who says, "I'm quite happy."
Sure, exactly, and that's why
they don't need Buddhism. They don't need
exactly, and that's why I said yesterday that usually people only come to this because of suffering, because they've had some heavy suffering. Otherwise, they don't. But this is the reality. But that doesn't mean that somehow you can't help those people to improve the life. So you have to.
Well, it's coming out of this assumption that human condition.
Human
condition is one of suffering.
But
and ignorance, and then.
Right, because the thing is that in most of our societies, what people's understanding is based on science and based on education and so forth. And basically the basic view is this is it, this is your life. And a lot of modern philosophies say, you mental afflictions, get rid of that. Impossible. All you can do is keep the lid on them a bit. Have an extra beer at the pub and things will be all right. And this is what people grow up with. And studies show that this is what we are not overwhelmed, this is what we are absorbed when we're growing up. This sort of idea that, the human condition is sort of not so good and you can't really do much to improve it. Just manage things a little bit better and that's it. And studies show that, but whatever worldview we get to, by the time we're early 20s, we're stuck. Basically stuck. Because by then, we've established some sort of worldview, and usually the worldview is something like this for the vast majority of people, and then they, okay, let's go with that. And then they put all their time and effort into that worldview, and then unless something dramatic happens that shakes that worldview, they keep piling along, and they find that, well, I'm not quite, things could be a little bit better. Maybe I just need a different job, a different holiday, different partner. If I just tweak things a bit, and people keep trying to tweak things for usually 30 years.
And then they die.
No. They usually keep tweaking things until they're about 50, and then they suddenly realize, and then of course usually the career thing is done, family have left, and then they sort of think, oh, actually, maybe there's something a little bit better than what I've been doing. And so studies show that usually people only shift their worldview once they hit 50. Because that 20 to 50 time, you've got your worldview and you're going with it. And unless there's some big thing that comes in, you don't shift. And this was my experience, is I also had a similar worldview because, that's what everyone tells us. So in my 20s, career thing, go. But I was very lucky because I ended up in IT in Switzerland when I was 26, 25. And then I got a lot of money. I was going skiing, I had a BMW, I was, doing all these things, which is the worldview, more of that and it's good. I had that sort of overnight, And for about a year, yeah, it was fun. And then after a year I thought, that's it? That's all that life has to offer? And I just went into depression, and that kicked me off. But most people don't have that opportunity. Most people get a little bit, they're still not fully happy. Well, maybe it's okay, you know, I can have a nicer meal at the restaurant or a few more beers at the pub, but still there's something not quite right. My life's not okay, but not quite there. Maybe if I just tweak this a little bit, get a little bit better job, bit this, and people do that for 30 years, and then usually at age 50, then they realize, well, hang on, maybe there's something else. And that's basically what happens. That's what happens. Yeah.
What about the interplay of karma related to two things, all-pervasive suffering and latency of ignorance?
Latency?
Yeah, I mean, all these imprints, I mean, you can see the thing is with karma and with seeds and latencies, these are really, what we need to be clear about is these are like concepts to explain processes. And we need to not grasp onto, you know, there's this sort of like karmic imprint. Because actually in the Prasangika, when they talk about karma, there's no talk about imprint. It doesn't exist. So we need to be careful we don't sort of concretize these ideas in terms of explaining these concepts. But is that what your question is, or something else?
I mean, especially about the all-pervasive suffering, I mean, we are enslaved by our past karma.
Yeah, but the result of karma is this.
Yeah.
Right. But
that's why we have all-pervasive suffering, because no choice, this thing which we call my need.
But the all-pervasive, the underlying reason we have all-pervasive suffering is this, of course. This leads to karma, leads to this condition. So yeah, karma is part of the process, but the underlying reason is this, of course. We won't be able to get rid of this unless we get rid of this.
And where is this coming from?
It's always been there. Because the thing is that, and this is the same in physics, is everything has a cause. You know, in physics, nothing comes into existence without a cause. And so similarly here, you can't just say that this just popped into existence at some time. So it's always been there.
Why do you think that it's nothing to do with how you're educated? If everybody was Buddhist and everybody thought that way, wouldn't people grow up with less ignorance?
Yeah, but his question is, where did it come from in the beginning? You're talking about what can we do about it?
Capacity changes, maybe.
No, I thought when you said seed of ignorance, you meant we're born ignorant, not that we've always been ignorant.
Sorry, I didn't catch. What did you say?
Seed of ignorance
Is habit. Habit.
Yeah, so, but are you saying we were born with that
Yeah,
habit?
absolutely. Yeah.
And you don't think this is something that we're taught?
There's two types of ignorance. There's what's called innate and intellectually acquired. So intellectually acquired is this. So yes, we get wrong information, wrong teachings, wrong things, and we add more intellectually acquired ignorance on top of this. But that type of ignorance is very easy to get rid of, relatively speaking. Whereas this is not so easy. For this, you need to realize emptiness. For that, all you need to do is educate yourself in a correct way, with conventional wisdom. That's easy, so to speak, to get rid of.
Glen, what is the answer to Shuki's question? Why are we inherently born with
We're not inherent, nothing's inherent.
Why are we born with this quality?
Because it was there before.
That's not my question, sorry.
Yeah.
Another one.
Yeah. No, I mean, we're going to talk, or maybe I'll answer that a little bit in the next session or this afternoon. I'm going to talk a little bit something related to this. So I think you'll get your answer there.
What I'm going to ask will reveal that I didn't grasp it totally, the emptiness, but I'm still going to ask because I want to know. Even if I understand, maybe I didn't, that there is no separate me and separate you, okay? And that there is only, I don't know if interaction or experience, what is the exact word? This is what exists. So I understand it, but still I want to be with you, even when I understand that it is the experience that connects us. I still want it. I still have the, I don't know if it's attachment.
Because again, intellectual understanding is not enough. We can be the smartest Buddhist scholar in the universe and be completely miserable. Really. In fact, maybe more miserable because we intellectually know we've got the answer, but nothing's changed, so therefore we even get more suffering.
So it's the meditation then?
Yeah, so we have to, I mean, we have to internalize that. We have to, because our behavior is not driven by our intellectual understanding. Again, we all intellectually accept impermanence. Do we behave as if things are impermanent? No, absolutely not. If we did, we would never have craving and attachment for anything because there's nothing to grab. This is what we need to do. We need to get that into experience, yeah.
Why do you write seed of ignorance at the end ignorance? The ignorance in two.
Yeah.
Is ignorance in action?
Yeah. This is another way of saying this. This is dormant. This is manifest.
Okay.
That's another way of saying these two: dormant and manifest.
Glen, how is it interrelated to self-grasping and self-cherishing?
Ignorance is another word for self-grasping, and self-cherishing comes on the basis of self-grasping.
So the seed of ignorance is not self-grasping.
Well, you could say that's dormant self-grasping, or the seed of self-grasping. Yeah, you could say that.
Can I connect it to Shuki's question about karma? It's the karma that drives us to self-grasping and self-cherishing? The ignorance is coming through those things, to the karma?
No, I mean ignorance is coming from ignorance.
Yeah.
Well, self-grasping is just another word for ignorance here. Yeah. And then self-cherishing is something that comes on the basis of that. So self-grasping is seeing ourselves as independent of the world. And usually once we do that, then the next step is, I'm not only independent of the world, I'm the center of the world. I'm the most important person in this world. That's self-cherishing. You can only have self-cherishing if you have self-grasping. But self-cherishing is another step on top of self-grasping.
So actually the seed of ignorance can be seen as the all-pervasive dukkha?
Well, we can understand all pervasive dukkha because of this.
But there's another stage.
We're in a state of all pervasive dukkha because this exists in our mind. You could say that, yes. Yeah.
Would you, to your comment from before, would you say that psychedelic drugs are a great way to get rid of the duality misconception?
Psychedelic drugs don't get rid of anything. I mean, they can potentially damage the brain. What they could do is they could...
I would not say that's a correct statement.
What's that?
Like, there's a lot of people, like a lot of research done into like healing people with many issues with psychedelic drugs.
But we're talking about psychosis. We're not talking about getting rid of ignorance.
Yeah, but in terms of your dualistic view of things, I mean, psychedelic drugs show you clearly that what you see, it's not what it is. I mean,
right, but the problem is,
it's not what you see.
but it goes back to the same question here before, is there are three stages in practice. There's intellectual, experience, and realization. Intellectual doesn't change anything. Experience, whether it comes from meditation or psychedelic drugs, has an effect, and that can have a flow-on effect, but it wears off. When the psychedelic drug is finished, that's it. We maybe learn something from the experience, sure, but that's not going to get rid of this. What we need to do is go one step further, which means we need to realize, which means we need to come to see this without stimulus, without drugs or without some stimulus. We need to realize this internally. That's what's missing in psychedelic drugs. So psychedelic drugs could potentially have a lot of positive impact if they're not damaging the brain and done properly, possibly, but they're always going to be limited in their helpfulness because it's a stimulus-based experience. It's not like it's not like you'll take psychedelic drugs and then at some point you won't need to take them because now you're seeing non-duality all the time. That's not going to happen with psychedelic drugs.
But isn't
You
it
need
the
more
same
and
as
more.
meditation? We use meditation to see it, but we always have to go on.
That's why we have to go from experience to realization. Because the same thing is when we meditate, we have a little taste, it has a good effect, it wears off. That's why we need to go further than that, otherwise we'll have limited benefit. That's why we need to realize emptiness, and we can only do that with a shamatha, with the calm, clear, focused mind. If we realize emptiness, then that is a permanent, a lasting state. Then we get rid of this 100%.
Related a little bit with what Shuli said. Theoretically, I can be with a lot of wisdom, no ignorance, no attachment, and from now on, yes, and still suffer from dukkha, from effect of past karma.
It depends when you say when you've realized emptiness, because when we realize emptiness, we wipe out those things in our mind. So that's all gone.
So
yeah.
the karma is
Well, if it's direct, yeah. I mean, they say that, like, for example, when we have one direct realization of emptiness is not getting us to nirvana. One realization is not enough for nirvana, but it starts to burn out mental afflictions and imprints and everything. Okay, morning tea break time, so let's have a break and then we'll have a look at this short-term strategy in the next session.